freaking sawdust. My goodness. Getting all over my camera. Well, hello! RC from the Mountaintop Joiner Shop here. Welcome to part 3 of my modern desk build series. In the previous episode, I did some leg shaping with a vintage compass plane. I did some domino joinery with a Festool Domino XL, and then I fixed a mortise that I misplaced. And so now that that's been found, I'm ready to move on to the next step. So what I'm going to be doing here is doing a dry fit of the aprons to the legs. I'm doing some measuring, so I know what I'm dealing with in terms of filling out the interior structure of the desk, which would be things like drawer pockets and the interior battens that are eventually going to support the work surface of the desk. So without further ado, let's head on over to the bench and see what we're dealing with here. All right, over here at the bench, I've started what I figured was going to be the next step, but isn't really. So let me explain. So I started to do a dry fit. I got the rear apron attached to the back legs, and I have the side aprons attached to the back legs because I wanted to measure the inside to inside distance between those side aprons. And so I can start to get a sense of how long the parts are going to need to be to fill out the interior structure of the desk, things like the drawer pockets and the interior battens that are going to end up supporting the work surface. But then that got me thinking about the work surface. I haven't milled that material yet. I don't know how thick that work surface is going to ultimately end up being, so I can't really do the interior structure of the desk just yet. I got to go mill all that material. I don't usually mill material with a particular thickness in mind because I'm flattening all my stock by hand. I might have some boards that are wonky enough that I have to make them quite thin, and ultimately that could change where the battens that are going to support the worktop need to be, so I don't end up with a work surface that sits proud or recessed down below the tops of the aprons. All that said, I'm going to continue to take my measurements so I know how long all the boards for my worktop need to be. So I measured the distance between these two aprons. It ends up being about 145 centimeters, or just inside of that, just a tiny bit. So that'll help me with the milling of the boards that are going to ultimately make up the worktop, and it's going to be in white oak. I have to start milling all that material down so I know how thick it's going to end up being. The other thing I need to know is how wide the panel I need to glue up is going to be, because my worktop doesn't extend all the way to the back apron of the desk. The back third of the top of the desk is going to be a kind of a raised area that has drawers and lift up lids and things like that in it. So I don't need my worktop to extend all the way to the back. But I do need to figure out the distance from the inside of the front apron to wherever those raised areas are going to start. Hope that makes sense. So I need to continue doing some dry fit. And one thing I'd like to share with you is a little trick about that. When you're dry fitting with dominoes, one thing you'll notice is that when you put a fresh domino into a mortise, it fits pretty tight. Sometimes if it's so tight that you can't really pull it back out again, sometimes you're getting out pliers and pulling on the domino, which could, of course, maybe damage the domino. So one of the things that I like to do to ease any dry fitting operations is take my domino. The reason it fits so tight is there's little ridges on the edges of it. What I like to do, come over here with a little block plane, and I got this like little violin maker's plane. It's very tiny, and that's really good for just taking the edge off of those dominoes, and then they end up sliding into here pretty easily, and I can get them out again, which is kind of the important part. This also really frees up a little bit of wiggle room to kind of draw all the parts together when you're doing your final glue up as well. So one of the things I like to do with dominoes when I'm doing dry fits. All right, so I trimmed a couple dominoes down, and now they're stuck in the leg there. Hopefully they're strong enough to keep the unsupported end of the leg from pulling it out of there. We'll stick it on here in a dry fit. No glue, please. All right, now I need to stick the end of my front apron into there, and then I know what the distance from the front down to about here is going to be, and I can take it from there. So let me get a couple more dominoes, we'll do that. Here's the side apron, let's stick that in there. You know, I could just stick the front apron into the leg, measure the distance from the inside of the apron to the inside of the leg, and then add that to the distance from the inside of the leg to where I want the top to terminate. But then I'm mathing, and then whenever you work with numbers, there's a chance you could screw those numbers up. You could have a little brain fart and next thing you know, you've screwed something up. So I'd much rather mark parts directly off of other parts where possible. If I can't do that, I like to measure parts directly off of the assembly as opposed to taking separate measurements and then adding them together and doing any kind of arithmetic whatsoever. The less math you use, the less likely you are to screw something up, especially if you're somebody like me who is arithmetically disinclined. Let's see what my distance is here. Since I already got this tape measure out, I'm going to just do it with that. About 50 centimeters. So I know how long the panel needs to be to create my work surface, and I know how wide that panel needs to be. Now I can go ahead and mill all that material. Early in my woodworking career, I might have gotten all gung-ho at this point, just started willy-nilly cross-cutting stuff to length and milling it down. Now I know a little bit better. So what I'm doing first is laying things down on the floor of the shop and doing a little bit of board selection first, and taking a peek at whatever boards I end up choosing to make the main part of the work surface, and seeing if there's things like defects, cracks, stuff like that. I know I want to make this board here, the one that's at the leading edge of the desk, because it's the widest board. So that's going to necessarily put the seams in this panel as far away from the leading edge of the desk as possible, so they're less likely to be noticed if you're doing some writing on the desk or whatever. So I'm going to be choosing that one for the end of the panel closest to the front of the desk. I notice on that board there's a knot here. There's a little, it's not a crack, it's more like a narrow void or something like that there. And they're kind of close to the edge, so I'm probably going to be zipping that edge of this board off. And also when I measure out the length of these boards, I'm going to be using the majority of the length of each of these boards, which means I have to decide which end of the board I'm going to be keeping and which end's going to get cut off. When I look at the underside of this board, wouldn't you know it, there's an end check right here. I definitely don't want that in this panel. It can mess things up functionally, it could mess things up aesthetically too, I suppose, but I know I'm going to be cutting that end of this board off. And there might be some stuff on the other end of the board that needs to be trimmed off too before I cut this to its not final length, but a little bit over long. And the reason I'm doing all that is because I'm milling these boards by hand, and it's much easier to mill a board flat by hand if that board is a little bit closer to its final length than just milling the board flat at its full length and then cross-cutting it to length. So I hope that all makes sense. Another thing I like to do now that I've picked this board is pick one to go next to it that's kind of close in color. Now I might not be able to get all these boards to match each other in color, that's fine, but at least if you put some thought into it, it's going to turn out better than it would otherwise. So you don't have a glaring contrast when you move from one board to the next. That kind of makes the seams stand out visually. That said, I don't have to worry about that as much with this given project as I would others, because I'm ultimately going to be either bleaching or whitewashing this work surface, or both. So that's going to even out the color dramatically. The whole thing's going to be white or very close to white. I'm going to do all that, and then I can finally start milling this stuff. So as evidenced by this pile of shavings at my feet here, I have finished flattening these boards by hand or running them through the thickness planer. And now they're ready for edge jointing, at which point I can then join them up into a nice big panel. But I didn't film the flattening of these boards by hand for a couple of reasons. One of which is, if you've been watching my videos at all, then you would have seen me do this already a whole bunch of times. So I didn't really feel the need to repeat it here. But also, once I start flattening boards by hand, I get locked in and I just can't do anything else. I can't go get my camera to hit record. I can't stop to take a piss. I can't stop to take a drink. I can't stop to snack. I can't stop to answer the phone. I just need to just power through it. And it's not so much because I enjoy flattening boards by hand, quite the contrary. In fact, I just want to get it over with. If I had a 12-inch helical cutter head joiner planer combo like I've always wanted, you can rest assured that I would be doing it that way instead. But this is the way I have to do it with the tooling that I have, so it is what it is. But it got me thinking. I had an issue with these boards that makes me think we need to have a talk about white oak. So what can I say about white oak? Well, for one thing, it is durable. So much so that it's very popular for shipbuilding, in part because of its durability, but also because it's rot resistant. And even though it's ring porous as woods go, the tyloses in it make it watertight as well. It was used to build ships like the USS Constitution, which later came to be nicknamed Old Ironsides because cannonballs that weren't a direct hit would just deflect off of the thing. So yes, white oak is very durable, and as such it is a very good choice of wood for things like worktops, tabletops, and desktops. So that's one of the reasons I'm using it. Also, if the wood is quarter sawn like this white oak is, it's quite dimensionally stable, so that's always a good thing for us furniture makers. And also, it's quite pretty to look at. It has these reflex in the grain that really add some natural beauty to it. Now, there's a time in days of yore where things like this might be considered defects, but around the time that the arts and crafts movement got going, things like this ended up being regarded more as character or natural beauty, and I very much agree with that. I think it's really pretty stuff, and especially if you enhance it with certain types of finishes, it's really pretty to look at. So for all those reasons, I'm choosing white oak for this desktop. Now that said, insofar as Gustav Stickley promoted the use of white oak in the arts and crafts movement and that whole hand tool aesthetic, I don't think that was the best idea. At least from my personal experience, white oak is not hand tool friendly in the least. If you're new to hand tool woodworking and you're looking to build some projects, white oak is not the wood I would recommend you use for those first projects, or probably even your second or third projects. I would use something like cherry, poplar, walnut, alder, soft maple, anything other than white oak, it seems. Case in point, when I was going to hand plane these boards to flatten them, I took a look at one end of a board and thought I was taking a pass with the grain, and it ended up being against the grain. In quarter sawn white oak, if you take a pass against the grain, it doesn't always just tear out at the surface level. Sometimes the blade of your hand plane will just dive underneath and just take a giant gouge out of it. It is horrible, and it's obviously something that's going to have to be dealt with later on down the line. Thankfully for me, when I run things through the thickness planer, even though it's a straight bladed cutter head, it tends to remove a lot of that nasty tear out that I get from those accidental passes against the grain. So yeah, the grain in these tends to run in and out. So even when I reversed that board that I was talking about and took a pass in the other direction, it tore out in the other direction. Just not as badly, but it's hard to take a pass, especially the full length of a board, without encountering some gnarly tear out somewhere along the line. Also, if you're chopping with white oak with chisels, it tends to blunt chisels as well, pretty badly. So you spend a lot of time sharpening that you might not otherwise have to if you're using a little bit softer wood like walnut or cherry or soft maple or any of those other ones that I mentioned just a moment ago. So yeah, that's the thing about white oak. Moving on. All right, so I got my boards laid out on one of my workbenches so I can kind of take a look at the boards and see how they play with each other, trying to arrange them in a way that is most visually appealing, matching color, matching grain pattern the best I can. And in so doing, I've noticed that there's a little chunk out of the edge of one of these boards, so I'm going to have to straighten this edge and then rip this edge off in order to get a nice clean edge from which I can edge joint all these boards and then join them together into a panel. But before I do that, because I've done all this work to get these arranged the way that I think is most visually appealing, I'm going to flip them all over and mark on the back of these boards a carpenter's triangle so I can keep track of them during the edge jointing process, because I'm going to be jointing each board to its mate individually and by hand. And so it'd be pretty easy to get these all scrambled up again in the future. So let me find a carpenter's pencil and put a big old triangle on the underside of this panel. I don't want to do it on the top because I don't have to deal with erasing pencil marks in the process of getting this finished, because I'm going for a bleached finish on this. Okay, so here again we have bumped into a whole bunch of subjects that I've already covered in quite granular detail in other videos. One of them is edge jointing long boards by hand. So you can look at my channel and find that exact title and learn more about that there. Now, one note I will make about edge joining boards by hand is that I'm only concerned about making the edges straight and square and mating up to the adjacent boards such that there are no gaps in between them. I'm not concerned with making sure that the edges of each board are parallel with each other. Instead, I glue up the panel and then square that panel up once it's all glued up. Another subject I've also covered is the Dowelmax joinery system. I really like using dowels to help align the boards to each other when I do a panel glue up. So you can find more about that in my channel as well. I've actually done a couple of videos on that subject. Another subject that I've also covered in great detail is gluing up panels without clamping cauls. So the Dowelmax joinery system helps me with that. It's not completely foolproof. There are, especially with these little 1/4 inch dowels that I'm using here, some seams where they're not perfectly even, but they're close enough that I can usually address that either with hand planes or with sanding. So that's what I like to do for gluing up panels in lieu of using clamping cauls. I think they really aren't worth the effort personally. And so then I got that glued up. I like to let that panel sit overnight, do a little bit of shop cleanup. I like to clean up my shop when it gets messy like this, because when I come into it the next day, if there's just crap everywhere, it's really hard for me to think. All right, well, I am back. I gotta say, walking into the shop today with everything kind of all cleaned up, there's shavings all over the place, I feel so much more ready to go than I think I would have if there was just a mess. So there's something to be said for keeping your shop tidy, at least for people like me. And I got my panel here. It's glued up, and there's plenty more work to do on this thing, but now that I know how thick my top is going to be, I can set this aside and work on the thing that I thought I was going to be working on from the very beginning of this video. So I'm going to move this out of the way, and then I'm going to repeat that dry fit that we did at the beginning of the video. So back to dry fitting. So I have my back apron, my side aprons, and the back legs all attached to each other. And the reason I'm doing that is because the offset from the inside corner of the back legs to where the rear and side aprons are mounted to the leg are the exact same distances as they will be on the front apron, or should I say front aprons, plural, because my front apron right here already has a section cut out of it. This is going to be the drawer front for the big pencil drawer. So I have these two ends of a front apron that need to be joined into a single sub-assembly that can then be attached to the front legs. Once I have that done, I can do a dry fit and stand this whole thing up on its legs, which makes it much easier to kind of measure out the inside of the desk and kind of build out its interior structure. So the pieces that are going to connect these ends of the front apron to each other are going to be the beginnings of a drawer box, the upper and lower kind of drawer dividers, so to speak. They need to not only connect these, but also overlap with the offset of these legs such that I can attach them to the front legs and make that front apron to front leg joinery much stronger. The secondary wood I'm going to be using for this project is a personal favorite of mine. This is soft maple. Soft maple is a little bit of a misnomer. It's not necessarily that soft of a wood, it's just softer than hard maple is. Generally speaking, hard maple is one of two species of tree. I think it's either silver maple or maybe sugar maple. But soft maple can be any number of different maple tree species depending upon what part of the world you are in. So whereas hard maple is actually harder than white oak by a little bit, soft maple is just a little bit softer than, say, like cherry. So it's still plenty hard enough to do the job of serving as a secondary wood inside of a cabinet or a desk like this, but it's soft enough to be easily worked with hand tools. It doesn't burn as easily when you machine it, has significantly lighter weight, and much less expensive than hard maple is. Soft maple is a secondary wood of choice for me. So what I need to do now is cut this to a length that fits in between these aprons. mill it down flat, and then I'm going to have to notch the ends of it to fit over the offset between the legs and the aprons. So I will show you how I do that once I get this cut down and milled. Alright, so I didn't film the milling process in its entirety because it's getting to be like beating a dead horse. But what I did was cross-cut that maple board with a panel saw, and then I cut that into as close as I could get to 4 equal width strips on the bandsaw, and then I flattened those strips using my jointer plane, and then ran them through the thickness planer and thinnessed them as far as I thought prudent to give as much clearance for a pencil drawer as possible. And then I ended up with this scenario, and it made me realize that my original plan of having an upper and a lower divider is not really going to work because this is a modern design. The top is going to be inset behind the tops of the aprons, which means that this upper divider is actually not going to be there. Let me move it down so you can see. It's going to be something more like that. And now you can see what the problem is here. That only leaves this much space for a pencil drawer, and once I put a bottom in that pencil drawer, it's barely deep enough to hold a pencil. And I don't think that's entirely, I think that's suboptimal. We'll put it that way. I don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do instead is change my plans, take that upper divider out entirely. The inset top is then going to become the upper divider. And of course I'm going to have to put a drawer guide here flush to the end of this apron here, and a runner behind here for the drawer to run on. So things just got really complicated, and it's really hard for me to explain what I'm going to be doing here in lieu of this original plan. So you're just going to have to ride along with me and see how it turns out. Situations like this kind of illustrate the differences between working out a design in a computer model ahead of time versus kind of designing things on the fly. On the one hand, had I worked out a computer model, I probably wouldn't have run into problems like this in the first place. However, if I did, then I would have to make changes on the fly anyways. So a lot of times what you work out in a computer model doesn't really work out in real life. Here, I don't really have any kind of obligation to follow a computer model at all because I haven't made one. So I can just go ahead and change things whenever needed as I move through the project, which I personally prefer, but you know, everybody's different. So next step for me is I got yet another dry fit going, and of course the importance of a dry fit can't be overstated if you're working out design as you move through it. This will be one of many, many dry fits in all likelihood. What I did was take some of those maple strips and took them over to the shooting board and shortened them until they just fit in between these aprons. What I'm going to do next is notch the ends of these strips so they fit around the step and the legs here, so they are flush to the top of the leg here as it sits and the top of this rear apron. And because the offset of the aprons from the inside corner of the legs is the same on both the back legs and the front, I'm going to do that twice. So one of these strips will go in the back and act as a ledger to support the back end of the drawer runner, and the front one will be the thing that connects the two ends of my front apron to each other. To mark out the notch in the end of the maple strip, I'm just going to kind of put it in place here. I'm going to take a marking knife and line it up with the inside edge of the leg. Just put a little mark on it there. Now, it's not that critical to me that this is right up against the inside of the leg, but what I do want is for the back edge of this ledger to be flush to both the inside of the rear apron and the front of the rear leg at the same time. But this is going to tie the apron and the leg to each other, as well as the domino joinery that I did earlier. Not as important at the back end of the desk as it is the front. Up front, I think it's quite critical, actually. So I'm going to be doing this to both of those strips. So I have one for the front and one for the back to match each other. And so what I want to do to make sure that I notch this deeply enough, but not too much, is to come in here with a wheel gauge, set it right on top of the back leg and drop it down, push it and then hold it tight. Has the exact measurement right there. So that's what I will cut to when I notch out this strip. So I took that little divot I made with my marking knife and just put a square up to it and carried that around the back side, and then I'm just going to go over the rest of that with my marking gauge, my wheel gauge. And I just have to remove all that material to that line. Of course, I have to do that on the other end of the strip and both ends of the other strip. Over here at the shooting board, I'm going to cut out the notch, and I'm not going to be too precious about it. I'm just going to cut along that knife line. And stop right about there. And then I'm going to remove the rest of the material with a chisel. Now I got it stood up in my leg vise, resting the other end of it down on the floor. So this is a little awkward because of how tall it is. It's a little bit wiggly, but we'll see if we can get away with this. So rather than cut down this with something like a dovetail saw, what I like to do is split it out with a chisel. That's something I picked up from Paul Sellers. Perhaps you've heard of him. And I like that technique quite well. So I'm going to, not knowing which way the grain direction is running in here, I'm just going to take a little bit off the end and split it out. And you can see that the grain is running the way I want it to. It's actually running out that way. That makes this a lot easier to do. So I'm just going to tap away this material until I've gotten to the point where I can drop this chisel right into that wheel gauge mark from earlier. Right up next to it now. I think I can take a little more off before I drop it into the knife line. And the reason I'm sneaking up on it, so to speak, is that it's much easier to control the direction of the chisel when you're not removing as much material. This material gives way more readily, and it doesn't push your chisel around the way it would if it was really thick material. So now I'm right on it. I'm going to sight right down the side of the chisel, make sure it lines up with this knife line. Sometimes I have to angle it inward just a little bit. Taking very light taps and working my way down, following the line as best I can. So this is really smooth behind here. I'm going to double check that it's square and everything, but it appears to me that it is right on the line. So that worked out beautifully. And I should be able to glue both this surface and this surface simultaneously when I install it into the aprons and legs. So looking good here. Just need to do that 3 more times. All right, so here's the next one, and I just wanted to make a note that I could just as easily do this by laying it down horizontally on my bench and then kind of clamping it down so it can't get away from me, and work in sideways with my chisel instead. The reason I don't do that is I'm much more accustomed to doing it vertically. I can kind of sight down the knife line more accurately that way than I can moving in horizontally. So I'm going to do it this way as long as this setup allows me to get away with it, but I just want to make you aware that there's more than one way to do this. So you may have just been asking yourself, what if the grain is actually working against you when you do this? Well, the very next one that I tried to do, that was the case. So I just darkened my knife line here with a pencil so you could see a little bit better. And you can see that I continued to split it until I was as close as I dared to my knife line. I took a piece of scrap against my shooting board fence to act as a backer, and then I'm going to go ahead and clamp this down. So when that happens, you of course can't split it along the grain. You'll instead have to pair it across the grain. By putting a backer here, when I exit the cut with a paring chisel, it's not going to blow out the fibers in the back corner of that. So I'm going to go in here and just remove material like this until I'm right down to that line. And I can even see if my paring chisel is parallel with the surface of my, what's this thing called? Bench hook. The surface of my bench hook So I'm going to rest the end of my paring chisel right in that line, try to keep parallel, wiggle my way in. Just like that. And you can see that half of my pencil line is still there. So I know I'm on the right track with this. Now I can use this surface that I've already cut as a place to rest my chisel and work this corner in the exact same way. I seem to be removing too thick a material, so I'm going to get rid of a bunch of it. Like that. And then go back to what I was doing, which is using the section that I already cut as a reference for the next cut. Gotta be really careful when you're doing it this way. It's looking pretty good, if I do say so myself. Let's continue our little game of what if, and in this case it's not a hypothetical, this actually happens. So what if you notch it out and despite your best efforts there's still a little gap under there? There's just a tiny sliver of daylight. That certainly won't make for a good glue surface. So what do you do to fix that? Thankfully in my case this is the same gap on both sides of this. So all I need to do is to take my joiner plane and take a little bit of material off the inside of this strip until that makes contact with the leg, and then stop. Thankfully with a hand plane you can just take a few thousandths of an inch of a shaving off at a time and really sneak up on the perfect fit. So that's what I'm going to do for this particular strip here. I don't know what happened there. I don't know if my wheel gauge slipped a little bit. Who knows? But it's easily fixable, so nothing to worry about. What if you trim off that material and you get to a point where this makes contact with the leg, but it doesn't make very good contact because when you split it out, it came out a little bit wonky. You don't have a very good glue surface. Well then, you can just put a little screw right through there. In my case, I think I will have some decent glue contact, but I might not rely on that solely. I might do both. I might put a little bit of glue under there, glue it, and then put a screw through there as well. Glue it and screw it, and it's always a good policy. So there is my front lower drawer divider and my back ledger to match. Right, just about ready to go. So I'm going to set these aside for now. What I need to do next is figure out how I'm going to tie in the ends of the front aprons with the back apron. Part of the purpose for that is whatever piece of lumber is going to go there is going to act as a drawer guide, and it will also help support the top, the worktop. And of course it'll help strengthen the overall structure of the whole thing as well. So what I ended up doing was going to my old lumber stash and finding some ambrosia maple in there that could serve this purpose. I have another big piece of soft maple that I want to keep handy for the drawer sides, for the pencil drawer, and possibly the little drawers are going to go up here. So I went to my lumber stash and got out these two pieces of ambrosia maple. And this is just soft maple that has some weird figure to it. There's like a beetle or a worm or something that bores holes through the wood and leaves a chemical behind, and then that chemical leaves some streaking in the wood that I think might be fungal or something like that, but it's not punky like a spalted maple would be. And this is just regular soft maple that has some character to it. So I grabbed that out, I milled it, and then what I decided to do for the joinery to the back apron is some parallel integral triple tenons. So let me show you what that looks like. So I put a baseline around here for how deep I want those tenons to be, or how long I want them to be, I should say. And then I just set my marking gauge, because this is 50 centimeters wide, I set my marking gauge to 1 centimeter, and then 2, and then 3, and so on, to mark out nice even tenons across here. And of course you can see the X's show where I'm going to be removing material. And the reason I decided to go with that as opposed to like dowels or maybe dominoes or something like that is in part strength, but also because this is going to be added to the interior structure of the desk after a lot of it's already glued up. So what I need to be able to do is round off the tenons and basically angle them into the mortise, and then the front end of this piece will then dovetail in to the inside of front apron there. So got a lot to do here, but basically what I'm going to do for this is just cut it out as if it was like a dovetail. As far as where to locate them, that part's actually easy because I have my front aprons about ready to go. They're going to line up just like this. So I'll put one to each leg, and of course I've made sure that these are nice and tight for the dry fit. Then all I need to do is put a little bit of a knife line there to show where that's going to be. And then these tenons are going to be just inside of that knife line. right about there. And of course I need to locate how far they are from the top of the apron. For that, I left a glue line here that kind of shows where the seam is, where this piece here and this piece meet each other. I then extended that line of that seam across the leg and down to the face of the inside face of the back apron. And then I know that from there, I'm gonna leave a little bit of space for the inset top, which is about 12 mil or so. All right, so I got my triple tenon set up, ready to cut here the same way I would if I was doing dovetails. And fortuitously, there's enough room in between the legs of my dry fit here to plot my bench on bench right in between the legs there. And that saves me the trouble of undoing this dry fit until I absolutely have to. I want to put off doing a dry fit or undoing a dry fit as much as possible, so I'm not doing like 800 dry fits. Instead I'm doing like 500 or something. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these. Now if you're new to doing joinery by hand with back saws like this, you might want to spend some time doing some practice cuts before you have at it. In my case, I've cut so much joinery over the years, probably going on, I don't know, 15, 16, 17, 18 years, that I'm pretty comfortable just going ahead and sawing to the line. But I just want to give you that word of warning that if you're a little bit out of practice, you might end up cutting some critical joinery crooked, and it might be worth your while to take some practice cuts first. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these now. Now I like to cut on the right side of the line because I am right-handed, right eye dominant, and then I will move my light to the other side and then cut on the left side of the other lines. That's just the way I like to kind of get warmed up, so to speak. And of course these cuts, if they're not perfect, if I leave a little bit of meat on the bone, so to speak, I can come back in there with a chisel and pare that out just fine. I'll move my light over and then cut to the other side. Go figure, that side actually turned out better than the other side did. But as long as you're not undercutting the joint, you can always pare away that excess material and things will work out just fine. Now I'm going to remove the bulk of the waste using my fret saw from New Concept. This is their 6-inch fret saw, and I have it set up the way I like to cut dovetail waste with the blade angled at about a 45-degree angle. It has detents that hold it at that position. That's one of the reasons this saw is fantastic. It's also very lightweight and it looks cool. I have a skip tooth blade in here. It's already under pretty good tension. I get right down near the baseline, as close as I dare. And cut across right there, just a millimeter or so away from that baseline. And then I'll be able to just chisel out to the baseline, just like I would with a dovetail after the fact. Running close to that baseline reduces the amount of chopping I need to do with the chisels. I can just drop my chisel right into that knife line there, and I'll know that my baseline is cut nice and even that way. On this second set of tenons, I don't know if it's because I was off camera or I'm more warmed up now or whatever, but I was able to just split my pencil line in half almost perfectly. So I probably won't have to do any paring at all on the sides of these tenons. Conversely, I left a little more meat on the bone when I cut with the fret saw, so I'll do a little more chopping here to get to that baseline, which is not a big deal at all. But that's one of the reasons I chose a triple tenon in the first place, is because there's kind of a strength in numbers type situation going on here, where if I didn't cut one of these sides quite perfectly, or I accidentally undercut it or whatever, I still have several other tenons to provide the strength there. And of course, if all three of them turn out perfectly, and so do the mortises, that's going to be wicked strong. I just realized I got a little bit ahead of myself and didn't mark the baseline for the dovetails on the other end. So I took my bench on bench and put it on the floor over there really quick, and then I measured the inside to inside distance between the front and rear aprons. That gives me the same distance as the baseline to baseline distance on these boards, which I then marked out with a marking knife and a square all the way around here. So that's the baseline for my dovetails at the other end. So here's the inside of my apron where these dovetails are going to be, and you can see that because of the taper of the apron, I'm going to need to kind of taper the ends of the dovetails, so to speak. So the way I'm going to do that is to put the back side of this apron against my knife line here. And I have a little line right here that you probably can't see. It's going to mark where the top of this drawer guide / desktop support needs to be. What I'm going to do is draw a line on the back side of this. Basically transfer the taper to the other side of the board. See that line right there? So that shows where the outside of the apron is. Now I need to bring this line back a little bit so my dovetails don't poke through the front of the apron, right? So I'm going to get a sliding bevel. The sliding bevel I'm using is from Blue Spruce Toolworks, and it's a custom one where I got to choose the color of the anodizing and the knobs, and of course the inlay here, which I believe is cocobolo in this case. I absolutely love this thing. It works like jewelry. Really treated myself when I bought the sliding bevel. Anyways, so what I did was take the angle off of the board that I had traced earlier, so you can see it there. And of course I can double check that by holding it up to the apron as well, and you can see it matches up perfectly. So I can then use this same angle. I can slide back the sliding bevel however far I want, to make room for the ends of those dovetails to fit inside the front of the apron. So I'm going to scoot it back maybe, I don't know, 3 mil or something like that, and then redraw that line, and that's going to be what I need to saw to remove the waste off the end of this board. It's about 3 mil right there. A little divot, and then I'll drop the tip of the knife into that same divot, bring my sliding gauge up to it, and mark that out. So that knife line is what I need to cut to, not the pencil line. All right, before I saw this, I'm going to deepen these knife lines with the paring chisels. I'm going to get in here just like this. And that's going to give a nice place for my saw to rest when I start the cut. So I'll be cutting right on that line. That said, the set of the teeth on the saw often sets me off of that line just the tiniest bit. But at that point, I only need to make maybe 1 or 2 passes with my shooting board plane to kind of smooth that end of that off, and of course make sure that's perfectly square. Let's go ahead and cut the waste off the end of this thing, dropping my saw right into that knife line to get started. And doing my best to keep the saw vertical. Like I said, the set of the teeth on the saw tend to set me just a tiny bit off on my knife line. So I'm just going to take 1 or 2 really light passes on the shooting board plane to clean this up and bring it right exactly to the knife line. And before I do that, I'm going to relieve the back corner here with a paring chisel. And that'll make it so I don't accidentally blow off the back side of this workpiece. And I'm going to be removing this corner anyways because I'm going to be putting some dovetails here. So I don't really have to even worry about that bevel I'm putting on there showing up later on. To set the shooting board fence, I'm going to use my sliding bevel that I set earlier. I left it on the exact same setting for this reason. And go ahead and loosen up my sacrificial fence, loosen up the angle, and then just slide it into place until it mates up to the base of the plane. I could try to say the side of the plane, I guess. Tighten down the sacrificial fence and the angle of the fence. And that should set me up perfectly for removing this material and squaring it up. Now, I want to make sure I'm taking a light pass, so I'm going to back this off and then advance the blade until I'm just taking a little bit of a cut. Not trying to remove a ton of material here. I can check it. Make sure I'm right on that line. Everything's nice and clean. That looks really good. I've already started marking out these angled dovetails on here, but I want to back up a little bit and show you what I'm doing here. So first thing I did was establish the outside corners of the dovetails, and I did that using a wheel gauge. And I set my wheel gauge to be the exact same distance as the offset from the front of the apron to the ends of the tails. Remember that was about 3.5 millimeters. So this is 3.5 millimeters, and then I just put a wheel gauge line here and on the other side to mark where those outside tails are. So that's going to be nice and uniform. To get the inside corners of my tails, what I ended up doing was taking a pair of dividers like these. These ones are by Alvin. This is a company that makes drafting tools. And I love these dividers, in part because they're inexpensive, but also because I have a center wheel here, so I can micro adjust the width of the dividers pretty easily with that. And then the tips of these are nice and pointy, quite sharp. So these are great for marking out dovetails like these. What I did was set them such that in 2 steps, I end up landing right in one of these knife lines that I had made with the wheel gauge. So that's 2 steps to give myself 2 tails. Then I put little divots in the wood, and then I can drop my mechanical pencil tip right into there, along with a square, slid up to it, that, and then drew a pencil line to mark the inside of my tails. The fun part is figuring out the angles here. For that, I got out this bevel gauge setter or angle finder thing from Veritas. I don't know what it's technically called, but as you can see here, it has all the dovetail angles, the different slopes set on one side. So you can set your sliding bevel to mark dovetail angles with that. There's imperial scales on both edges, which I don't really use imperial anymore, and nor have I ever used that scale on here, but they may as well since they got the room there. You can also set the angles for polygons, for miters. I'll tell you what angle to set it for depending on the number of sides your polygon has. So that's pretty nifty. On the back side here, you have bevel angles from 0 all the way up to 60 degrees marked on here. So you can use it both to find existing angles and also set your sliding bevel to a hypothetical angle. So what I ended up doing was taking my sliding bevel, which is already set to this angle here, and I want to use that as my baseline for setting my angles here, and I want a 1/6 slope or thereabouts because that's my favorite slope to use. I just like the way it looks. So what I ended up doing was figuring out what angle I currently have on here, and it ends up being really close to about 8 degrees. It's just a tiny bit shy of 8 degrees. It's like 7 3/4. So I'm just going to round that off to 8. And then I asked the internet, how many degrees is a 1/6 slope? And the answer it spit out was about 9.5 degrees. So I'm going to go ahead and just round that off to 10. So 10 plus 8 is, of course, 18. So I'm going to set my bevel gauge to 18 degrees. All right, so that's set to 18 degrees now. Now I can mark the uphill corners or edges of the dovetails. So I'm going to be marking this one and this one here. I'm going to set the stock on there, line it up with the pencil line on top, and mark my pencil line on the outside down to the baseline. So there's one. I'm trying to do it without getting in the way of the camera too much. There's the other one. Now I need to do the angle on the downhill side of the dovetails. For that, if you'll recall, I started with 8 degrees on this angle here. To offset it from that to 9.5 degrees, I need to just minus 8 from 9.5 to give me 1.5 degrees. So I'm going to set my bevel to 1.5 on here. Doesn't look like much of an angle, but there it is. Now I'm going to go mark the downhill side of these dovetails the same way I did the uphill side. There we go. So hopefully you can see these pencil lines okay. I think these dovetails are going to look really sweet. And unfortunately they're going to be covered up by the drawer sides on the desk. But this is a little bit of foreshadowing because the pencil drawer itself has a tapered front on it, if you'll recall. So I'll be doing pretty much the same exercise when I build that drawer. And those dovetails will be visible, and because they're angled like that, they're going to look rad. Now I'm transferring the triple tenons and the dovetails to their corresponding workpieces. In this case, I have these triple tenons that need to go into the back apron of the desk. And it's very difficult to hold a long piece like this kind of in position. It wants to scoot around. It's just kind of waving around in the air here, and it's just difficult. So what I ended up doing to kind of aid in this marking transfer process is to put a saddle square here, and I'll zoom in so you can see it. I put a saddle square up against the workpiece and slid it right up to where the knife line is. I double checked that it's actually square to my reference edge, and then I just clamped it in place. And then I have something to kind of hold this up against once I have it positioned where it needs to be, like so. And that just makes it just a little bit easier to hold it still while I lean in here with my marking knife and mark these tenons out. That's a little trick that I came up with to make that a little bit easier. I've encountered a similar transferring technique issue with the way I normally transfer dovetails over here because these aprons are wedged. So when I clamp them into my leg vise where I normally transfer my tail marks. It's kind of wiggly in there. I don't love that. And besides, these pieces with the dovetails in them are so long that they bump into the wall back there and they stick out too far. So they, I can't even make them line up if I wanted to doing it that way. So what I came up with for a solution for that is to open up my vise really wide, take a workpiece like this. I want to put the height of the end of my apron, same height as that. And I'm just kind of going by feel here and trying to make sure it's as vertical as I can make it by eyeball. Something like that. I've got that tightened in place now like that. Now I need to figure out which of these pieces I'm transferring this tail from. Looks like it's this one, so that's going to end up going like that. So I need to support this way out here. So the way I'm doing that is just taking my other drawer guide. You'll recall that I set this to the same height as this when it was over here. Now I can rest that like that and get everything nice and lined up and transfer my tails to the apron just like that. When I put the other apron, it's going to be facing that way. So I can just do the same thing here with the hold fast, have the stick out over here, lay it across that way, and transfer my marks that way as well. Now I'm over here at the drill press. And it took me a while to set up the shop because there's lots of random crap everywhere. Like, by random I mean things like I have a sticker here with a bunch of lightning bugs in a jar. I have an Amazon envelope for some reason. A golf tee, which I don't golf. I actually use this for gardening. It's kind of a long story. I have a plastic chair behind the camera here that my wife won't let me get rid of. Such is the state of affairs when you have a garage shop. In any event, what I'm doing over here is getting ready to hog away most of the waste of these mortises. I have a Forstner bit set in here that is just a tiny bit smaller than the mortise is wide. And then I have it set to the depth of the mortise I want to cut. And then I'm going to line it up to the fence such that I can drill a hole at each end of the mortise and then maybe one down the middle to remove as much material out of here as I can. That's what I like to do for mortises that aren't, like dominoes or dowels or whatever. So this is a great way to do it. If this mortise was longer, I'd do another hole right down the middle there and remove these two little points here, but they're so minor that I don't think it's really even worth the effort. So I got a bunch more of these to do, and then I'll take it over the bench and just remove the rest of the material with chisels. I'm over here at the bench chiseling out these mortises, and what I like about operations like this is I can sit down for a little bit. I can get the weight off my feet, the pressure off my back. I have a little swivel stool that I can sit on. And it's nice to have operations that allow you to do this kind of thing because I feel like you can get more done in your shop when you're not in pain or sore or just tired. So now I will have to stand up once in a while when I make my final cuts. I'm going to have to sight down the chisel to make sure I'm vertical. I'll be sitting for a lot of this operation as well as when I chisel out those dovetail sockets in a minute. All right, so I finished up these mortises, and one of the tricks that I used for kind of fitting the mortise was to take a carpenter's pencil and then just color in the inside of the mortise with pencil lead as much as I can. And then drive the tenon home, and it'll leave pencil lead on the tenons wherever the joint is too tight. And then I can remove that material either on the tenon itself, basically remove whatever blackened material there is there, just a tiny bit of it, or the corresponding spot inside the mortise, depending upon which I felt was easier to get to. And the end result is triple tenon. Let's get it all lined up here. Fits pretty nice. The one thing I'm going to need to do is take these ends and round them off just a little bit because I'm going to have to angle it into the mortise and then bring it to square in order to attach the dovetails at the other end. So it's going to be installed kind of in situ, so to speak, after the rest of the project is already halfway glued up. So that's one thing I have to do yet, but I'm pretty satisfied with the way it's fitting currently. This is pretty nice. So between the marking out of the mortises, the drilling the mortises over at the drill press, then chopping them out, and then adjusting the fit and pairing and checking the fit and pairing some more, fiddling with it and all that stuff, I've probably spent about an hour, hour and a half doing these triple tenons. So that's why it's nice to have other options like the dowel joinery or a domino, but sometimes the traditional way of doing something is really the best way to do something. So even though it took longer and it took a lot more effort, and there are probably other ways to get around doing this that are probably a lot more expensive, this is the way it had to be for me. I think this is the most appropriate style of joinery for this particular spot in this particular project. All right, back to the Mortising vise and cutting out the dovetails on these aprons. And once again, I've run into a little bit of a conundrum when it comes to work holding because of the taper of the aprons. That's fine, I think I figured it out. This Mortising vise that I have on here does have the ability to clamp tapered parts to a point, but these tapered parts are too tapered because the side that's on the thin side of the apron will have to clamp down so tight that the end of the chop will be closed all the way and still not be clamping this all the way across the face of the apron. What I ended up doing was taking both of my aprons, because they're both tapered the same amount, I can flip one over, meet them to each other, and then I have parallel faces that I could clamp this up with. So I'm gonna have one stick out more than the other because I'm gonna be cutting those dovetails next. I am able to clamp it pretty tight. So I can go ahead and transfer my lines down to the base lines on the face here and go ahead and cut this out the same way I would any other type of half-blind dovetail. The same technique for pairing the two aprons with the tapers together so that they complement each other and create a parallel face works for clamping it down to the bench and chiseling out the dovetail sockets as well. I've already covered dovetails in granular detail in both build videos and also in standalone videos, so that's why I'm not really showing anything about dovetail technique here. But I would like to give a shout out to one tool in particular that I think is really helpful for doing half-blind dovetail sockets like these. This is the fishtail chisel from Blue Spruce Toolworks. You can see there's the little tree logo on the back there. And this one they give you custom options for, so I ended up choosing one with a brass ferrule and a curly maple handle that is rounded at the back end for applying hand pressure and pairing. This one is 1/2 inch, and I think the other one I have is like a 3/8 inch. So I have two of these that match each other. And this thing is just awesome for reaching down into these tight corners here where a straight-sided bench chisel can't get to. So great tool that I could easily recommend to anybody who does this kind of thing by hand. Well, that ended up being kind of fun. I ended up talking about all kinds of subjects I didn't realize I was going to be talking about when I started this episode. So as always, I hope you got something out of it. And I realized through the course of filming it that I don't need to cover every single technique in granular detail every time it comes up, especially if those techniques are ones I've already covered in previous videos. I figure if you're watching a build series, you're doing so because you want to see me build the furniture and not so much because of the techniques that are involved. So as always, I'm going to share certain tips and tricks and things like that come up as I think of them, but ultimately I'm going to be putting together furniture and not so much talking about the techniques in great detail like I might in a standalone video. So I hope that all makes sense. I didn't quite finish all of the interior structure of the desk. That's going to be required before I can start gluing up sub-assemblies. Those parts aren't really as exciting as things like hand-cut triple tenons and angled dovetails. So I'm going to do that on my own, and when we come back in the next episode, hopefully I'll be able to start gluing up some sub-assemblies and a furniture-shaped object will appear in my shop, and that's always exciting. So hope you'll join me for that. We'll see you then. Now if you like what you saw here, please hit like and subscribe. It'd help me out a lot. Also hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified anytime I release a new video. And if you didn't like what you saw here, keep it to yourself, pal. Or watch one of my other videos. You might like one of those. Thank you for watching.